In the quiet heat of Mississippi, in the year 1840, there was a plantation where nothing was openly spoken, yet everything was known, where letters were written in careful ink, folded twice, and hidden not to preserve love, but to survive the truth. This is the story of an enslaved man whose body became a shared secret between two sisters, a story that did not survive because it was remembered, but because the letters did. Before we begin, if you're drawn to stories history tried to erase, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss another chapter, and stay with us until the end, because this story only reveals its full weight in silence. The Mississippi sun beat down relentlessly on the Harrow Plantation, turning the wide fields into a shimmering sea of heat, where the rows of cotton stretched farther than the eye could see, their white tips glinting like distant stars. The house itself, a tall white-columned structure perched on a slight rise above the fields, seemed to absorb that heat, radiating it back in waves through the wooden floors and hallways, the air inside thick with the scent of waxed floors, polished furniture, and the faint, ever-present undertone of fear that lingered like dust in every corner. It was a house built to be admired, to demonstrate wealth, status, and order to any visitor who approached along the long sun-baked drive. But inside, it held a different reality, one far less orderly, far more complex, and far darker than the neat rows outside suggested. It was here, in this imposing house, that Eleanor Harrow, the plantation's mistress, had learned that appearances were everything, and that nothing about the life of an enslaved man could remain invisible for long once he entered the domestic sphere. Samuel, the man at the center of this story, had arrived at the Caldwell plantation, though everyone called it the Harrow Plantation now after Eleanor's marriage, not long before Eleanor's younger sister Clara was sent to live with her. He had been taken from a neighboring plantation, reassigned from the fields to the house, ostensibly for his intelligence and literacy, though in truth he was reassigned because he could be trusted to hold secrets that were too dangerous to entrust to anyone else. Samuel was not large in stature, nor was he physically imposing. Rather, he carried himself with a quiet attentiveness, a kind of patience that had been honed through years of surviving scrutiny and violence. Every glance, every word, every small gesture was carefully calculated, because he knew that misstep could mean punishment, or worse, death. Yet, it was this very attentiveness that drew Eleanor's attention almost immediately. She watched him moving through the hallways, saw the way he handled the furniture, the doors, the letters that crossed his path, and understood quickly that he was different from the other enslaved men who had passed through her home. He could be counted on, he could be observed, and most importantly, he could be used. Clara's arrival added another layer to this delicate system. The younger sister, widowed and alone, came into the household carrying her own grief and uncertainty. She was quiet, more reflective than Eleanor, and she viewed the house and its people as a labyrinth to be navigated carefully. Where Eleanor commanded, Clara pleaded. Where Eleanor used authority, Clara relied on persuasion. Samuel noticed the difference immediately, though he knew better than to acknowledge it openly. He observed her in the mornings as she moved through the rooms, sometimes lingering by the windows, looking out over the fields with a gaze that seemed to measure both the distance and the limitations imposed upon her. She did not yet know that he, too, was constantly measuring the house, each movement, each glance, each whispered conversation. He was learning a map of secrecy, a chart of power invisible to those who had never needed to read it. And already, before a sigh, no word was spoken about boundaries or proprieties. He understood that both women saw him differently. He was not merely a servant. He was, in some sense, a repository, a living vessel for a secret neither had dared to articulate. The first weeks passed in an uneasy rhythm. Samuel was given domestic tasks, overseeing the preparation of Eleanor's personal chambers, ensuring the proper handling of correspondence, monitoring the storage and delivery of documents that crossed the sisters' hands in quiet secrecy. It was tedious work, yet dangerous in its subtlety. One careless step could reveal more than intended. And the house itself, which seemed at first to offer comfort and predictability, revealed its own demands. Each room carried history, each hallway whispered warning. The floors creaked in ways that seemed to anticipate movement, the shutters rattled as though to confirm their presence. Samuel learned quickly that he could not simply walk, he had to glide, to move in rhythm with the expectations of the house, understanding that the walls themselves were listening and that Eleanor and Clara expected him to know when to speak, when to remain silent, when to act without question. Eleanor's reliance on him grew in ways subtle but relentless. She did not command him harshly, her authority was quieter than that. She presented requests as necessities, gently, almost conversationally, yet Samuel sensed the sharp edge beneath the tone. Her need for control was absolute, and she sought in Samuel the assurance that her will, her secrets, her management of the household could be maintained without interruption. At first, this felt like protection. He was insulated from the prying eyes of other servants, from the casual scrutiny of visitors. He was, in a sense, elevated. But Samuel understood that elevation in a household like this came at a cost. The closer he was to Eleanor, the more visible he became to everyone else, and visibility in that world was as dangerous as exposure. There were rules he could not break, boundaries he could not test, because his presence near Eleanor was both a shield and a chain, protective and imprisoning, all at once. Clara, meanwhile, observed him differently. She did not yet assert control, but she began to speak to him quietly, asking questions that were more intimate than household instruction should allow, inquiring about small details, offering hints of trust and connection that Eleanor did not. Samuel noted these moments, not as comfort, but as another layer of entanglement. Each glance, each small interaction, carried the weight of expectation, and he had already learned that in the Harrow household, expectation often outweighed instruction. A word of displeasure, a shift in tone could unravel everything. And yet, even as the sisters' needs began to intersect around him, Samuel found himself bound not by choice, but by the invisible architecture of power and secrecy that he was now part of. The first letters began to appear shortly after Clara settled into the house. Eleanor, precise and controlled, wrote with careful attention to her words, conveying information about household management, while Clara's letters carried a hint of longing and vulnerability. Samuel, though not their intended audience, became their inadvertent guardian. The letters were folded and hidden, passed between rooms and sometimes entrusted to him, who had learned to read between the lines before he even opened them. He could sense, without seeing, the subtle ways in which both sisters measured him, gauging his reactions to ensure his presence reinforced their plans. And so the letters became more than communication. They became instruments of control, subtle tools for maintaining influence over him without requiring confrontation. Samuel understood this quickly. Silence, he realized, was not absence, it was agreement. By the time the first month passed, Samuel's position in the house had shifted in ways he could not escape. He was no longer simply an observer or a servant. He had become an essential part of a system neither sister fully articulated. Eleanor depended on him to maintain the order she demanded. Clara depended on him to sustain the emotional support she lacked. And Samuel, caught between the two, understood that his movements, his words, his very presence were no longer his own. He was constantly balancing the unspoken desires and expectations of two powerful women, each with her own claim on him, each with her own methods of influence. The letters he handled, the tasks he performed, even the way he answered questions, all had become part of a delicate choreography he could not disrupt without consequences that might ripple far beyond himself. Samuel also began to notice the reactions of others in the household. The servants, initially indifferent, began to watch him differently, their glances lingering, their whispers trailing off when he approached. They sensed the unspoken hierarchy that had emerged, and though no one spoke openly of what was occurring, the tension was palpable. Samuel learned to move with both caution and purpose, to speak only when necessary, to make himself present yet invisible. He was aware that the balance he maintained was fragile, and that the moment it tipped, the repercussions would extend beyond the house itself, potentially reaching the neighbors, the overseers, and even the wider social networks that govern plantation life. In that world, visibility could destroy a person, and invisibility offered only temporary reprieve. As weeks turned into months, Samuel's awareness of the plantation's rhythms grew almost instinctively. He could anticipate Eleanor's moods, understand Clara's silences, predict when a letter would arrive, and even sense when the household itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an event that never came. He moved through the rooms with a kind of practiced grace, balancing the needs of the two sisters while carrying the unspoken weight of their secrets. And all the while, the letters continued to accumulate, hidden, folded, secreted away in corners and drawers. They became Samuel's responsibility without acknowledgement, and he understood, with a quiet and steady certainty, that the survival of those documents was as important as the survival of anyone in the house. They were the only tangible trace of the arrangement, the only record of what had passed between the sisters and the enslaved man they claimed without consent. In this first phase of his life at the Caldwell plantation, Samuel learned that survival required adaptation, observation, and above all, discretion. Every glance, every word, every pause in the house carried weight. The air itself seemed heavy with expectation, and he understood that the invisible chains he bore were as binding as iron shackles. Yet in that same awareness he also discovered a kind of power, not freedom, but understanding. He understood the forces at play, the motivations, the vulnerabilities, and the ways in which silence and obedience could preserve life. And as the sun set on the first months of his new existence, casting long shadows across the polished floors and the cotton fields beyond, Samuel stood in the center of the house, aware of the delicate and dangerous balance he was sustaining, and of how little of himself he would retain if that balance continued indefinitely. The months that followed brought with them a rhythm that Samuel quickly learned to anticipate, a cadence of expectation and silence that defined life within the walls of the Harrow plantation. The house, wide and imposing by any standard, had become both a stage and a cage, and every room held a distinct purpose in this invisible performance. Eleanor's chambers were the epicenter of control, where she orchestrated the household, managed the overseers, and maintained the illusion of order to the outside world. Clara's presence, quieter but no less potent, added a layer of unpredictability, a gentle yet insistent pull toward human connection that Samuel could neither embrace nor evade. In this triangular space of power and secrecy, he became the hinge upon which daily life turned, the silent observer, the unacknowledged participant, and the keeper of what could never be spoken aloud. Samuel's mornings began long before the sun had risen above the distant tree line, the humid Mississippi air already heavy and thick, carrying the scent of damp earth, cotton, and the faint tang of smoke from the kitchen hearth. He moved silently through the halls, ensuring that everything in Eleanor's chambers was prepared to exacting standards, the linen smooth and wrinkle-free, the writing desk orderly, the quills and inkpots in precise alignment. Each item he touched was a testament to the expectations imposed upon him, a subtle confirmation that his presence mattered in a way that no one dared to acknowledge openly. He could feel Eleanor's gaze even when she was not physically present, a psychological weight that pressed upon him as insistently as any chain. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains in the morning breeze reminded him that he was not invisible, that his every motion was measured, judged, and catalogued. It was during these early hours that the letters began to arrive with more frequency. At first they were simple, household instructions, reminders of schedules, lists of goods to be ordered or delivered. But over time, their tone shifted, becoming more intimate, more coded, and increasingly reliant on Samuel's discretion. Eleanor's writing was precise, formal, laced with authority and expectation. Clara's, in contrast, contained hints of vulnerability, questions meant not for response but for acknowledgement, small invitations for Samuel to recognize his unique position in their household. The letters were hidden between the folds of furniture, tucked beneath the edges of floorboards, or pressed between the pages of ledgers. Samuel learned to locate them instinctively, to read them without overt attention, and to deliver responses with a balance of respect and invisibility. The weight of these communications was not merely logistical, it was emotional, psychological, and deeply binding. By the time the first full year of Samuel's service passed, the lines between duty and possession had become increasingly blurred. Eleanor's expectations of him extended beyond domestic labor. She required his presence as a constant, an assurance that her authority would be maintained in her absence. Clara, who had initially seemed fragile and uncertain, began to assert a quieter form of control, one that relied on attention and emotional dependency rather than overt command. Samuel found himself navigating a labyrinth of power, one that demanded careful calculation at every turn. A misplaced word, a misread glance, a hesitation in action could unravel the delicate balance he had come to understand as essential for survival. Each day became a negotiation, each interaction a subtle test of endurance, and Samuel, ever observant, learned to exist within the constraints imposed upon him without allowing them to consume the entirety of his awareness. The letters, now arriving with increasing regularity, served not only as instruments of control, but also as a reflection of the sisters' inner worlds. Eleanor's handwriting, crisp and deliberate, conveyed instructions, expectations, and the occasional expression of concern masked by authority. Clara's script, more fluid and hesitant, hinted at loneliness, longing, and a desire for connection in a world where such expressions were dangerous. Samuel became the intermediary, the silent witness to this interplay of desire and power. He carried the letters carefully, knowing that their content could destroy him if discovered, yet understanding that they also offered him a rare glimpse into the humanity of those who wielded authority over him. Envelope, each carefully folded sheet of paper, became a repository of secrets, a tangible manifestation of the invisible bonds that tied him to Eleanor and Clara, bonds that were both protective and confining. As the seasons changed, the plantation itself seemed to mirror the growing tension within the house. The summer sun burned the fields to a pale gold, the humidity clinging to skin and fabric alike, while the nights brought oppressive darkness, broken only by the distant call of night birds and the occasional flicker of candlelight through curtained windows. Samuel moved through this environment with the ease of someone who had learned to blend into both light and shadow, to anticipate the rhythms of human behavior as meticulously as he did the patterns of the fields and the shifting currents of the Mississippi River beyond the plantation boundaries. He understood that his survival depended not only on obedience but on perception, on the ability to interpret subtle cues and respond in ways that would satisfy the unspoken demands of Eleanor and Clara without drawing attention from others in the household. In these months, Samuel also began to observe the reactions of those around him, the other enslaved individuals whose lives were governed by the same rigid hierarchies, but who had not yet attained the precarious proximity to power that he now occupied. They watched him with curiosity, suspicion, and a measure of envy. Some whispered behind closed doors, wondering why he seemed favored, why he moved through the house with an authority unspoken yet understood. Others offered cautious camaraderie, sharing small pieces of information or warnings about Eleanor's moods, Clara's whims, or the subtle dangers inherent in being too visible or too invisible. Samuel learned to navigate these social currents with the same care he applied to his duties within the house itself. He understood that in the Harrow household, survival was not a matter of strength alone, but of intelligence, perception, and the ability to balance multiple demands simultaneously without faltering. The letters continued to accumulate, each one a testament to the evolving dynamics within the household. Eleanor's communications increasingly relied on Samuel's discretion, instructing him to manage situations that required delicate handling, to deliver messages that could not be spoken aloud, and to ensure that the sisters' intentions were carried out with precision. Clara's letters, while more personal, also required careful management, as they contained expressions of desire, concern, and dependence that could destabilize the household if exposed. Samuel became the custodian of these written words, the silent participant in a dialogue that was never meant to include him directly, yet whose consequences would affect him most profoundly. The weight of this responsibility was constant, a psychological pressure that never diminished, yet one that Samuel bore with a quiet resilience born of necessity and experience. By the end of the second year, The patterns within the house had solidified. Samuel's movements, his attentiveness, and his ability to anticipate the needs and desires of Eleanor and Clara had become integral to the functioning of the household. He understood the nuances of authority and dependence, of visibility and discretion, in ways that surpassed simple obedience. He had become essential, not merely to the daily operations of the plantation, but to the maintenance of the secrets that bound the sisters to him and to each other. Each letter, each interaction, each silent moment carried with it the potential for revelation or disaster, and Samuel navigated this landscape with the precision of someone who had learned that survival required both vigilance and subtlety in equal measure. The subtle power dynamics between Eleanor and Clara began to shape Samuel's perception of his own role within the household. He recognized that Eleanor's command was as absolute but calculated, designed to maintain control over the household and to project an image of authority to the outside world. Clara's influence, by contrast, was quieter but no less potent, relying on emotional presence, subtle persuasion, and the cultivation of dependency. Samuel's position between these two forms of influence was precarious. He became a bridge, a silent arbiter of competing needs, and a participant in a system that demanded both compliance and ingenuity. Each day presented new challenges, each interaction carried hidden consequences, and each letter he handled contained layers of meaning that extended far beyond their immediate content. As Samuel became more entrenched in the household, he also developed a deeper understanding of the risks inherent in his proximity to power. He observed the reactions of the servants, the overseers, and even visitors who came to the plantation, recognizing the ways in which his presence could be interpreted, manipulated, or misrepresented. He understood that Eleanor and Clara's control over him was contingent not only on their own authority, but also on the perceptions of those around them. His every action had to be carefully calibrated, balancing obedience with subtle assertion of presence, discretion with awareness, and survival with the maintenance of the fragile equilibrium that sustained the household. By this point, the letters had become more than instruments of communication. They were a lifeline, a record, and a weapon. Eleanor used them to maintain her authority, Clara to sustain connection, and Samuel to navigate the perilous landscape of expectation and control that defined his existence. The weight of these documents was palpable, a tangible representation of the unseen bonds that connected the three of them. Samuel understood that these letters, hidden away in drawers, pressed between books or tucked into corners of the house, were the only witnesses to the complex and unspoken relationships that governed the plantation. They carried truths that could never be spoken aloud, desires that could never be openly acknowledged, and fears that could destroy them all if revealed. By the time the second year drew to a close, Samuel had internalized the rhythms, expectations, and dangers of the Harrow household. He moved through the rooms with a practiced grace, read the letters with an understanding of their unspoken meanings, and navigated the competing demands of Eleanor and Clara with a precision that allowed him to survive. He had become an invisible yet indispensable part of the household, the keeper of secrets, the silent witness, and the bridge between authority and vulnerability. In this precarious position, he learned the essential lesson that would guide him in the years to come. Survival depended not on visibility or strength alone, but on the ability to observe, to understand, and to act with discretion and intelligence in a world that demanded both obedience and awareness. By the time the third year settled over the Harrow plantation, the dynamics between Eleanor, Clara, and Samuel had matured into a precarious, almost imperceptible equilibrium, one that depended on his constant vigilance and unwavering discretion. The house itself seemed to sense the tension, creaking and groaning under the weight of secrets it had held for decades, every shuttered window and polished banister a silent witness to the private negotiations of power, fear, and desire. Samuel had become the axis upon which the household revolved. He moved with a careful rhythm, anticipating Eleanor's precise expectations, responding to Clara's subtle emotional cues, and maintaining a delicate balance that left no room for error. His survival depended upon a mastery of perception, the ability to see the hidden layers of interaction, to understand not only what was spoken, but what remained unspoken. The letters, now a permanent fixture of daily life, had grown more intricate and lay, arid in tone. Eleanor's correspondence increasingly contained coded instructions, phrases whose meanings shifted depending on context and timing. A simple reference to the drawers or the West Room could indicate a change in schedule, a test of loyalty, or a warning about an approaching visitor. Clara's letters, by contrast, were often more vulnerable, hinting at longing, curiosity, and even jealousy, yet always carefully phrased to avoid discovery. Samuel became not just a courier, but an interpreter, a mediator between the sisters' desires and the guardian of the invisible threads that connected them. He knew that one misstep could unravel the fragile trust that kept him alive and relatively protected. As the year progressed, Samuel began to notice a subtle shift in the household's rhythms. Eleanor's authority, once absolute and unchallenged, was increasingly tempered by the quiet influence of Clara, whose presence had become more assertive even without overt declaration. The younger sister had begun to use Samuel as an instrument of negotiation, subtly directing his movements, asking questions that elicited responses not merely of information, but of presence. Each interaction with Samuel became a demonstration of control, a way to assert power without confrontation. Eleanor, aware of this influence but unwilling to cede any ground, relied more heavily on the letters, ensuring that her expectations were communicated clearly and discreetly, often leaving Samuel to manage the subtle conflicts that arose in her absence. In the midst of these evolving dynamics, Samuel's own understanding of the household deepened. He began to perceive the emotional currents that flowed beneath the surface, the subtle tensions between desire and fear, authority and dependence. He recognized that Eleanor's meticulous oversight was not solely about control, but about survival, the preservation of her social standing, the protection of her family's reputation, and the maintenance of the plantation's outward image of order. Clara's influence, in contrast, was grounded in human connection, in the ability to create dependency and attachment without threatening the established hierarchy. Samuel, caught between these forces, learned to navigate a landscape where power was both invisible and absolute, where survival demanded attentiveness, adaptability, and an understanding of human psychology that went beyond simple obedience. The plantation itself mirrored these complex relationships. The fields stretched endlessly into the distance, the cotton plants swaying under the relentless Mississippi sun, their pale boles a reminder of the labor and oppression upon which the household's wealth depended. Beyond the cultivated land lay dense woods and winding creeks, places where whispers traveled, but secrets could also be hidden. Samuel moved between these spaces with a growing awareness of his dual existence, part laborer, part confidant, part keeper of truths that could destroy lives if revealed. Each day in the fields was punctuated by subtle observations, the way the overseer's gazes lingered too long, the quiet conversations between servants that hinted at suspicions or envy, and the occasional flash of understanding in Eleanor or Clara's eyes that reminded him of his unique position. He learned to exist in two worlds simultaneously, the visible, performative world of labor and household routine, and the hidden, psychological world of secrecy, desire, and control. Letters continued to shape the contours of his life. Samuel's careful handling of them became an essential part of the household's functioning. Eleanor's instructions required interpretation, often demanding that he anticipate her needs before they were explicitly stated. Clara's letters demanded emotional intelligence, an ability to respond in ways that acknowledged her subtle manipulations without inviting scrutiny. Samuel became increasingly aware of the stakes involved. Each letter was a potential weapon, each misdelivered word a possible downfall. He developed a meticulous system for managing the correspondence, memorizing delivery schedules, noting the placement of hidden compartments, and maintaining an internal catalogue of coded phrases and references. In this way, Samuel transformed from a passive participant into an active agent within the household's secretive network, though always under the shadow of unspoken threat. The psychological toll of this existence was significant. Samuel's nights were often restless, the plantation silent but for the faint rustling of leaves and the distant call of nocturnal wildlife. He lay awake, considering the letters, replaying interactions, analyzing gestures and predicting outcomes. The weight of responsibility was relentless. He was simultaneously a servant, a confidant, a mediator, and a silent observer of human behavior. Every decision, every movement, carried consequences that could ripple outward, affecting not only his own safety, but also the delicate balance of power between Eleanor and Clara. In these quiet hours, he contemplated the impossibility of freedom within the plantation, the limitations imposed by social hierarchy, and the emotional burden of being intimately entwined in the lives of two women whose lives and reputations depended on secrecy and control. By mid-year, Samuel's position had become increasingly complex. The sisters' reliance on him was total yet unspoken. Eleanor's authority was enforced through structured routines, precise instructions, and the subtle expectation of obedience, while Clara's influence was emotional, leveraging attention, proximity, and the quiet power of dependency. Samuel existed at the intersection of these forces, a human fulcrum maintaining the equilibrium that kept the household functioning. He observed the sisters' subtle communications, their unspoken agreements and disagreements, and the nuanced ways in which they asserted influence over one another. This observation required constant vigilance and emotional acuity, as the consequences of misreading even a single gesture or phrase could be catastrophic. The letters became increasingly daring, their contents more personal and revealing. Eleanor wrote not only of household management, but also of fears and strategies, her pen revealing vulnerabilities masked by authority. Clara's writing conveyed desires, frustrations, and moments of jealousy, sometimes hinting at the impossibility of her position, always couched in language that would not betray her intentions if intercepted. Samuel became the living archive of these communications, carrying their weight and ensuring their secrecy. Each letter was both a document and a manifestation of power dynamics, a reminder that the invisible structures of control and influence within the house were as binding as chains, yet more psychologically potent. Samuel's interactions with the broader enslaved community became increasingly nuanced. Other workers began to notice his proximity to the sisters, whispering in hushed tones about his apparent favor and unique position. Some approached him with guarded curiosity, while others watched with suspicion or envy. Samuel navigated these social dynamics with the same careful attention he applied within the house, understanding that alliances, perception, and reputation were critical to his survival. He developed subtle strategies to maintain distance without appearing aloof, to respond to inquiries without revealing his knowledge, and to project neutrality in a world where any display of preference or dissent could be perilous. His life became a continuous negotiation, a series of calculated choices designed to preserve both survival and a measure of autonomy within the rigid constraints of the plantation. By late summer, the intensity of the household's secretive interactions reached a crescendo. Eleanor and Clara's letters had become intertwined, forming a dialogue-mediated entity. Rely by Samuel. He carried their words, interpreted their intentions, and executed their instructions with precision, all while navigating the invisible tension that their mutual involvement created. The plantation, the fields, the house, and the hidden compartments where letters were stored became an ecosystem of secrecy and control, with Samuel at its center. He understood that the stability of this ecosystem depended entirely on his ability to maintain discretion, anticipate needs, and mediate the unspoken conflicts between the sisters. His role, though unacknowledged, was indispensable. Autumn approached. Samuel's understanding of the household's inner workings had deepened to a near-perfect clarity. He could predict Eleanor's moods with remarkable accuracy, sense Clara's subtle manipulations before they were acted upon, and anticipate the shifting dynamics of the broader household with intuitive precision. The letters, now a vast network of communication, had become both a tool and a trap, carrying with them the potential for both protection and exposure. Samuel's careful stewardship of these documents, combined with his ability to navigate the emotional landscape of the sisters, allowed him to maintain the fragile equilibrium that defined life on the Harrow plantation. Yet he remained ever aware of the precariousness of his position, understanding that the system he had learned to operate within could collapse at any moment in the quiet hours of late autumn as the air grew crisp and the Mississippi sun cast long shadows across the fields. Samuel reflected on the nature of his existence within the Harrow household. He recognized that he had become more than a servant, more than a confidant. He had become the living repository of secrets, the guardian of unspoken truths, and the silent mediator of power and influence. The letters, with their delicate interplay of authority, desire, and dependency, had become a central part of this dynamic, shaping his movements, his interactions, and even his perception of self. He understood, with a clarity born of necessity, that survival in this world required a mastery of observation, discretion, and adaptability, qualities that had allowed him to navigate the complex, often perilous relationships that defined his life on the plantation. By the time autumn deepened into the damp chill of late November, the Harrow plantation had become a house of quiet tensions and whispered authority, each corner and corridor echoing with the weight of unspoken rules. Samuel, whose life had become defined by careful observation and the meticulous execution of duties, found himself navigating increasingly treacherous waters. The letters that once simply communicated instructions had transformed into instruments of control, surveillance, and, at times, subtle coercion. Eleanor and Clara's correspondence revealed a complexity that extended far beyond domestic management, delving into matters of secrecy, influence, and even manipulation. Samuel had become the conduit for this invisible exchange, the one person entrusted to carry not only the words, but the intent behind them. The responsibility was immense, and he bore it silently, knowing that a single misstep could unravel not only his precarious position, but the fragile equilibrium of the household itself. The season's shift brought with it changes in the rhythm of life. The sun rose later, casting long shadows across the cotton fields, and the wind carried a sharpness that reminded Samuel of the ever-present dangers of exposure. Within the house, the sisters' reliance upon him grew more pronounced. Eleanor, ever precise, assigned tasks that demanded not only physical labor, but a keen awareness of timing and nuance. Clara, increasingly perceptive, tested the boundaries of influence, using subtle gestures and half-spoken requests to gauge Samuel's responses. He had learned to read between the lines, to anticipate their intentions before they were articulated, and to act with a balance of obedience and discretion that preserved both his safety and the sisters' mutual secrecy. Each day became an exercise in psychological navigation, a delicate dance of anticipation and interpretation that left little room for error. The letters themselves had evolved in tone and content, becoming more intimate, more revealing, and more demanding. Eleanor's writings, while still cloaked in the guise of household management, increasingly hinted at her expectations, fears, and judgments. She used language that was precise yet loaded, creating layers of meaning that required careful interpretation. Clara's letters, on the other hand, revealed a vulnerability that belied her outward composure, expressing longing, frustration, and subtle attempts at emotional leverage. Samuel, as the intermediary, became the living embodiment of their communication, translating words into action, presence, and consequence. He understood that every movement, every glance, every response was scrutinized not only for compliance but for insight into his loyalty, intelligence, and discretion. Within this charged environment, the emotional toll on Samuel was profound. He navigated a life in which personal agency was constrained by invisible chains, where the smallest miscalculation could result in punishment or suspicion. The duality of his existence, performing the expected duties of an enslaved man while simultaneously managing the sisters' intricate web of desire, control, and secrecy, demanded constant vigilance. Nights offered no relief. In the darkness of his quarters, he replayed interactions, analyzed letters, and anticipated potential crises. Sleep was shallow, punctuated by dreams of misinterpretation and exposure, each one a reflection of the ever-present anxiety that defined his daily life. The plantation itself mirrored the complexity of the household. The cotton field stretched endlessly, a pale sea that concealed both labor and observation. Beyond the cultivated land, the woods and creeks provided spaces where whispers could travel unheeded, yet secrets could also be hidden. Samuel moved between these spaces with acute awareness, understanding that the plantation was both a stage and a prison. Each interaction with other enslaved workers was calculated, maintaining the appearance of routine while subtly managing the perceptions of loyalty, authority, and discretion. Samuel's understanding of social dynamics extended beyond the household, encompassing the broader environment in which he existed, a world where reputation and perception were as crucial as obedience and silence. As the year progressed, subtle changes in the sisters' behavior became apparent. Eleanor, who had previously wielded authority with unwavering precision, began to exhibit signs of unease, a quiet tension that suggested she was aware of the growing complexity of their situation. Clara, sensing the shift, became more assertive, using Samuel as a bridge to influence both the household's operations and Eleanor's decisions. The letters reflected this dynamic, containing coded language that required careful interpretation. Samuel, increasingly relied upon as both executor and confidant, recognized the delicate balance that now defined his existence. His role had shifted from passive obedience to active management of the household's emotional and social equilibrium, a position fraught with risk and burdened with responsibility. The arrival of winter intensified the pressures on Samuel. Shorter days and longer nights meant more time within the house, more observation, and more opportunities for subtle manipulation or testing by the sisters. Eleanor's instructions became more exacting, demanding not only physical execution, but the careful reading of tone, context, and implication. Clara's communications, though ostensibly casual, carried layers of meaning designed to gauge loyalty, elicit attention, and assert influence. Samuel navigate these demands with a careful combination of attentiveness, patience, and emotional acuity. He understood that the survival of the household's delicate equilibrium depended upon his ability to mediate these interactions, to anticipate and mitigate conflicts, and to maintain the secrecy upon which both sisters relied. The letters themselves began to reveal the depth of the sisters' psychological entanglement. Eleanor's writings expressed concern over reputation, fear of scandal, and the desire to maintain control in a world where social norms were rigidly enforced. Clara's letters, while seemingly more personal and intimate, also contained strategic elements, reflecting an understanding of power and influence within the household. Samuel's role as intermediary placed him at the intersection of these complex dynamics. He became the repository of unspoken truths, the guardian of secrets that could destroy lives if revealed, and the active agent in maintaining the balance of power. His actions were both guided by survival and shaped by the moral and emotional weight of his position, a constant negotiation between compliance and conscience. The daily routines of the household became exercises in subtle power dynamics. Samuel observed the unspoken communications between the sisters, noting shifts in tone, gesture, and expectation. He became adept at predicting their reactions, managing interactions to prevent conflict, and maintaining a semblance of normalcy in a situation defined by secrecy and tension. The letters, delivered and interpreted with care, became extensions of the sisters' influence, shaping the flow of daily life, the distribution of labor, and the emotional climate of the house. Samuel's presence was simultaneously invisible and indispensable, a living instrument of the household's hidden operations. By midwinter, the cumulative weight of these dynamics began to manifest in small but significant ways. Samuel noticed subtle changes in Eleanor's demeanor, hesitation in decision-making, increased attention to detail, and a heightened sensitivity to potential exposure. Clara, sensing these shifts, subtly increased her influence through proximity, observation, and the careful crafting of letters. Samuel, fully aware of the stakes, adjusted his own behavior to maintain balance, employing a combination of discretion, anticipation, and psychological insight. His role required constant adaptation, as the household's internal dynamics were in flux, influenced by emotion, fear, and the ever-present need for secrecy. The plantation, silent and imposing in the winter light, seemed to amplify the tension within the house. The fields, bare and unyielding, mirrored the emptiness and exposure Samuel felt, while the house itself contained the dense, suffocating weight of secrets. Every movement, every decision, and every delivery of letters carried consequence. Samuel's awareness of this reality shaped his existence, instilling a heightened sense of vigilance and a meticulous attention to detail. He navigated the household as both participant and observer, balancing compliance with understanding, obedience with insight, and presence with discretion. By the end of the year, the letters had become an intricate system of communication, an invisible network that connected Eleanor and Clara, mediated entirely through Samuel's careful stewardship. Each missive carried layers of meaning, requiring interpretation not only of words, but of intent, context, and emotion. Samuel had become the living embodiment of this network, translating letters into action, presence, and consequence, ensuring that the household's fragile equilibrium remained intact. The psychological demands of this role were immense, yet Samuel's skill, intelligence, and resilience allowed him to navigate these challenges with a combination of subtlety, foresight, and patience. In the quiet reflection of winter evenings, Samuel recognized the profound complexity of his situation. He existed in a space defined by secrecy, power, and influence, where survival depended upon a mastery of observation, interpretation, and emotional intelligence. The letters, while seemingly mundane, had become the instruments through which authority, desire, and control were exercised, and Samuel's role as intermediary was both indispensable and perilous. He understood that his survival, the stability of the household, and the delicate balance between Eleanor and Clara were all contingent upon his ability to navigate this intricate web of relationships with precision and discretion. As winter slowly loosened its grip, the Harrow plantation did not breathe easier. Instead, the household seemed to thrum with a more subtle tension, a kind of invisible pressure that pressed upon every corner and hallway. Samuel's life, already consumed by the intricate web of obligations and observations, became even more constricted as Eleanor and Clara's unspoken expectations deepened. The two sisters had moved beyond the careful exchange of letters that had once simply managed household matters. Now their correspondence served as a code, a private language meant to secure not only their desires but their control over Samuel himself. Each missive carried intention beneath the words, instruction beneath the pretense of casual commentary, and both Eleanor and Clara seemed to take a quiet satisfaction in knowing that only Samuel could interpret the full meaning. For him, every day was now an exercise in decoding, anticipating, and acting, not merely surviving, but constantly balancing the invisible scales of power and secrecy. The house itself seemed to sense this transformation, as if its walls absorbed the weight of tension and amplified it. Eleanor's presence was measured and exacting. She would glide silently through rooms, her movements deliberate, her gaze assessing, always aware of Samuel's proximity. Clara, by contrast, was more subtle in her manipulations, weaving herself into interactions in ways that seemed casual but were meticulously calculated. Samuel learned quickly that the sisters' dynamic was no longer about open communication, but about dominance and influence, a psychological game in which he was both participant and pawn. The letters acted as extensions of this game, folded, hidden, and exchanged with an almost ritualistic reverence. They were more than words on paper, they were instruments of negotiation, coercion, and subtle assertion of control, and Samuel carried their weight silently, knowing the stakes could not be overstated. Winter's lingering chill made the house feel even more like a cage, one in which Samuel had to move with extreme care. Every step, every glance, every word, even the smallest gesture, could be read, interpreted, and remembered. He had long ceased to act only out of duty. Survival demanded that he anticipate the sisters' moods, decipher their subtle cues, and respond in ways that would not provoke suspicion or displeasure. Eleanor's letters now contained instructions that were intentionally indirect, requiring insight to implement correctly, while Clara's writings increasingly played upon emotion and obligation, using the weight of expectation to assert influence over both Samuel and Eleanor. The complexity of this system left Samuel in a near-constant state of vigilance, every action weighed against potential outcomes, every word considered for unintended consequence. The psychological toll of this existence was compounded by the paradox of visibility. Samuel had to be seen, yet never noticed in the way that mattered. He was the household's eyes and ears, its silent executor, its secret keeper, and yet his presence had to be unobtrusive, almost ghost-like. This duality required constant attention. He could not afford carelessness, for any misjudgment could trigger suspicion or disrupt the fragile balance Eleanor and Clara had created. Even ordinary tasks, preparing the household for visito, delivering messages, managing domestic routines, were imbued with an additional layer of scrutiny. Samuel performed each with a meticulousness born of necessity, aware that error was not an option in a situation where appearances and perception were as critical as obedience itself. The letters themselves became increasingly cryptic as the sisters grew more aware of the delicate nature of their arrangement. Eleanor, always precise, employed subtle phrasing to express commands, often cloaked in words that suggested routine yet carried implications of control and judgment. Clara's letters were equally nuanced, blending sentiment with instruction, probing Samuel's compliance and attentiveness while simultaneously testing Eleanor's boundaries. Samuel, already attuned to subtleties, became the living interpreter of this layered communication, translating text into action, presence, and careful observation. Each day brought new challenges, requiring him to anticipate not only what was written but what was implied, what was unsaid, and what might be inferred from gestures, tone, and timing. The household operated as a delicate ecosystem, and Samuel was the central node through which all energy, emotion, and authority flowed. As the days grew longer and the light of early spring crept over the plantation, subtle cracks began to appear in the sisters' equilibrium. Eleanor's meticulous control sometimes faltered under stress, revealing glimpses of anxiety that hinted at the fragile nature of her authority. Clara, perceptive as ever, noticed these moments and adjusted her own behavior to capitalize on Eleanor's vulnerability, further complicating the household's dynamic. Samuel, already burdened by the constant mediation required of him, now had to navigate these new shifts in tension. His role demanded a careful balancing act, maintaining loyalty and discretion while protecting himself from the unpredictable outcomes of human emotion. Every decision carried weight, every misstep could be catastrophic, and yet Samuel continued to move forward, guided by a combination of intelligence, experience, and a deep understanding of the psychological landscape in which he existed. The psychological complexity of the household was matched by its social isolation. The Harrow plantation was remote, bordered by cotton fields that stretched endlessly and forests that seemed to contain their own silent judgments. Samuel's interactions outside the house were limited, constrained by the physical and social boundaries imposed upon him. Within the house, however, every interaction was a test of perception, an assessment of loyalty, and an exercise in subtle negotiation. He learned to move through spaces with awareness, to anticipate reactions, and to manage the flow of information with precision. The letters, while ostensibly mundane, became the currency of power, a tool through which Eleanor and Clara extended their influence, manipulated perception, and maintained control over both Samuel and the household. The emotional demands of this arrangement were relentless. Samuel's existence was defined by tension, expectation, and the constant need for vigilance. He could not afford to act on impulse, express frustration, or reveal discontent, for any sign of weakness could be exploited by Eleanor or Clara. Sleep offered little respite. Dreams were frequently haunted by scenarios in which misinterpretation, exposure, or conflict threatened to unravel the fragile balance of the household. Even moments of relative quiet were charged with potential consequence, as Samuel moved through spaces that were simultaneously familiar and fraught with latent danger. His survival depended on a combination of observation, strategic thinking, and emotional discipline, skills that were honed daily through experience and necessity. By late spring, the physicality of labor and domestic responsibility merged with the psychological complexities of the household, creating a relentless rhythm that Samuel had no choice but to follow. Tasks that might have seemed simple, preparing meals, delivering letters, tending to the household's needs, were imbued with an additional layer of meaning, requiring careful consideration, precise timing, and strategic judgment. The letters, now more numerous and layered, demanded not only execution but interpretation, understanding the sisters' unspoken intentions and acting in ways that preserved both discretion and balance. Samuel's awareness of the consequences of each action, each word, and each gesture became finely attuned, as if every moment carried the weight of both his survival and the household equilibrium. Throughout these months, Samuel also became acutely aware of the fragile nature of human behavior under pressure. Eleanor's occasional lapses, Clara's strategic interventions, and the ever-present gaze of the household combined to create a psychological environment in which he was perpetually alert. He learned to anticipate moods, decipher subtle shifts in tone, and act with foresight, using the letters and their instructions as guides to maintain balance. This vigilance became second nature, shaping his daily life in ways that were both invisible and profound, creating a rhythm of action, observation, and interpretation that defined his existence on the plantation. The culmination of these dynamics created a tense, almost claustrophobic atmosphere. The Harrow plantation, with its wide fields and imposing house, contained a network of secrets and unspoken expectations that trapped all who lived there in an invisible web of control. Samuel's role as intermediary, executor, and observer placed him at the center of this web, balancing authority, desire, and survival in a way that required constant attention and careful judgment. Each day was a negotiation, each interaction a potential test, and each letter a subtle instrument of influence and manipulation. Through it all, Samuel navigated the household with skill, intelligence, and a growing understanding of the complexities of power, secrecy, and survival. By early summer, the weight of months spent in this delicate balance was evident even to those who could not see it. Samuel moved with a quiet vigilance, aware of the consequences of any lapse, and Eleanor and Clara continued to communicate in their coded, layered ways, relying upon him as the conduit through which their intentions and influence flowed. The household had become an ecosystem in which power, secrecy, and survival were intertwined, and Samuel's role was both indispensable and perilous. Yet, even under the constant pressures of observation, expectation, and subtle coercion, he continued to maintain the equilibrium, his actions guided by a combination of skill, experience, and the deep understanding that survival depended upon both discretion and insight. As summer deepened over the Harrow plantation, the weight of its unspoken truths pressed ever more heavily upon Samuel. The heat clung to the house like a dense shroud, making each room feel smaller, each corridor more confining. The open fields of Mississippi outside seemed at first glance to promise freedom and expansiveness, yet they mirrored the house's boundaries rather than offering release. Samuel understood this duality intimately. Outside, the world was vast but unforgiving. Inside, the house was narrow, oppressive, and inescapable. His existence, suspended between the sisters' desires and the harsh codes of the plantation, had become a delicate dance, a careful choreography that left no room for error. Every glance, every gesture, every pause carried significance, and Samuel bore the invisible burden of constant vigilance. The sisters' letters, now arriving with greater frequency, were no longer merely communication. They had become instruments of subtle coercion, psychological leverage, and covert command, each line carefully measured to ensure he remained under their influence. Without any overt coercion, Eleanor, whose presence was usually precise and measured, now exhibited cracks in her controlled facade. The pressure of maintaining appearances and ensuring the household's smooth operation weighed on her, and Samuel noticed the faint tremor in her hands when she wrote letters late at night, the slight hesitation in her voice when she issued instructions, as though she feared overstepping invisible boundaries. Clara, observing this with keen perception, began to insert herself more deliberately into the spaces between Eleanor and Samuel. She was softer in her tone, more persuasive in her words, yet beneath this gentleness lay a sharpness of intent that Samuel could not ignore. The letters from Clara became longer, more layered with meaning, and increasingly focused on testing his attentiveness, his discretion, and his ability to navigate the unspoken demands of both women simultaneously. Samuel realized that he had become more than a servant. He was the conduit through which the sisters' desires, fears, and strategies flowed. Their control was subtle, insidious, and nearly absolute, mediated through him in a way that made refusal impossible without immediate consequence. The days bled into each other in a rhythm dictated by routine and expectation. Samuel's mornings began before sunrise, moving quietly through the sleeping house to prepare the tasks that would define the day. Meals, letters, domestic upkeep, all were exercises in balance, requiring him to anticipate both Eleanor's meticulous standards and Clara's shifting moods. By mid-morning, the sisters' presence became a constant reminder of his inescapable role. Eleanor's keen eyes followed him through rooms, noting minute deviations from expectation, while Clara's quiet observations were no less penetrating. Samuel moved with practiced precision, aware that a single misstep, however small, could unravel the fragile equilibrium that had been established over months of careful negotiation. The letters, folded and hidden beneath layers of domestic routine, reminded him of the persistent, intangible threads of obligation and expectation that stretched taut between the sisters and himself. Summer's oppressive heat did little to soften the tension that now defined the household. The physical labor required to maintain the house and grounds was arduous, but it was the psychological labor that demanded the most of Samuel. He found himself constantly scanning the environment, anticipating reactions, interpreting glances, and adjusting his behavior to meet expectations that were often contradictory. Eleanor's instructions emphasized obedience and precision, while Clara's subtle suggestions nudged him toward emotional attentiveness, empathy, and a kind of silent complicity. Samuel understood that these expectations were not arbitrary, they were calculated strategies of control, designed to ensure that he remained indispensable and compliant, his presence a buffer and stabilizing force within the household. The letters, increasingly coded and nuanced, were evidence of the sisters' growing reliance on him as both executor and observer, their intentions conveyed not in plain language, but through layered, often contradictory instructions that demanded constant interpretation. By midsummer, Samuel's awareness of the household's psychological landscape had deepened into something resembling intuition. He could anticipate Eleanor's moods before she spoke, read the subtle shifts in Clara's posture and tone, and navigate their interactions in ways that preserved equilibrium while avoiding direct confrontation. Yet, this mastery came at a cost. Sleep offered little relief as his mind replayed interactions, analyzed letters, and projected potential consequences. Each night brought a sense of suspended tension, a knowledge that any misjudgment could result in visible censure or a subtle but devastating withdrawal of trust. The letters, though physically small a, ND discreet, loomed large in his consciousness, their coded meanings a constant presence in both his waking and dreaming hours. Samuel had become a living archive of the sisters' unspoken strategies, a vessel through which their intentions, desires, and fears circulated continuously. The intricacy of this arrangement extended beyond the household's walls. Samuel was acutely aware of the larger social context, the expectations imposed by the plantation economy, and the rigid social hierarchies that governed interactions between enslaved and free. Eleanor and Clara's letters sometimes included references to visitors, overseers, and distant relatives, all of whom could unintentionally disrupt the delicate balance within the household. Samuel's role, therefore, extended beyond the immediate presence of the sisters. He was also responsible for mediating interactions, maintaining appearances, and ensuring that the fragile equilibrium was not threatened by external forces. This responsibility was invisible to the wider world, yet it consumed much of his energy and attention, shaping both his movements and his thoughts throughout the day. As the season progressed, small tensions began to ripple beneath the surface. Eleanor's meticulous control occasionally faltered, revealing moments of doubt or anxiety that Clara was quick to exploit. Clara's letters became subtly more assertive, encouraging Samuel to act in ways that reinforced her influence, while simultaneously maintaining Eleanor's trust. The interplay of authority, desire, and expectation created a dynamic that was both unstable and enduring, with Samuel perpetually positioned at the center. Each decision, each action, each interpretation carried weight, and the consequences of error were never immediate or obvious, but always latent, waiting to manifest in ways that could disrupt the household's fragile balance. Samuel's growing understanding of these dynamics did not alleviate their psychological toll. He was acutely aware of his own vulnerability, the impossibility of asserting autonomy, and the constant pressure to interpret and execute the sisters' intentions with precision. The letters were a constant reminder of this reality, each folded page carrying not only instructions but the implicit expectation of compliance, discretion, and subtle judgment. Samuel navigated this environment with a combination of intelligence, observation, and careful strategy, his movements guided as much by instinct as by conscious decision. The household had become a stage on which power, secrecy, and survival were performed continuously, and Samuel was both actor and audience, mediator and participant, caught in a cycle of expectation that demanded relentless attention. By late summer, the psychological complexity of the Harrow household had reached its apex. Samuel's role as intermediary and observer had expanded to encompass nearly every aspect of daily life. He managed the flow of information, interpreted coded instructions, and maintained the appearance of obedience while silently bearing the weight of expectation. The letters, increasingly nuanced and cryptic, were now not only tools of influence, but also repositories of intent, containing traces of desire, anxiety, and strategy that Samuel carried with him constantly. He had become the living embodiment of the household's secrets, the invisible force that sustained the fragile equilibrium between Eleanor, Clara, and the broader social world. Survival, he realized, was not a matter of strength or skill alone, but of understanding, adaptation, and the ability to navigate a web of influence and expectation that was at once invisible and omnipresent. In these months, Samuel also became acutely aware of the ways in which silence and absence carried meaning. Words could be interpreted, letters decoded, and actions anticipated, but the unspoken carried a weight that was equally consequential. A glance, a hesitation, a carefully measured pause. Could signal compliance, dissent, or understanding, and Samuel learned to read these cues with precision. Eleanor and Clara relied upon these unspoken communications as heavily as upon the letters themselves, and Samuel became the interpreter and executor of both, his presence a constant conduit through which meaning, intention, and expectation flowed. The household, therefore, functioned as a complex system of signals and responses, each element intertwined with the others, and Samuel's understanding of this system became central to the maintenance of equilibrium and survival. By the end of the summer, the relentless tension had begun to manifest in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Eleanor's letters occasionally contained hints of impatience, while Clara's correspondence suggested an increasing desire for control and influence. Samuel, attuned to the nuances of both, navigated these shifts with care, his actions guided by a combination of experience, observation, and intuition. The psychological landscape of the household had become so intricate that even minor deviations could produce disproportionate consequences. Samuel's survival and the continued functioning of the Harrow household depended upon his ability to anticipate, interpret, and act with precision, maintaining the delicate balance of power and expectation that defined every interaction, every gesture, and every letter exchanged within its walls. By the time autumn began to bleed its muted colors across the Mississippi landscape, the atmosphere inside the Harrow plantation had grown heavier than the oppressive summer heat. Samuel's existence, once defined by labor and observation, was now consumed by anticipation, the constant navigation of moods, silences, and the subtle maneuvers of the two sisters who had claimed him, each in her own way. Eleanor's control, precise and cold, had become sharper in the months since summer began. She no longer merely guided him through tasks or whispered instructions in letters. She began to test the limits of his discretion, probing the edges of his obedience in ways that were invisible to all but the most attentive observer. Her letters contained layers of meaning, half-sentences whose implications could shift depending on context, tone, or the day's events. Samuel learned to read between the lines with a speed and precision that became almost instinctive. Every crease of a paper, every smudge of ink carried potential consequences. Misreading even a single nuance could have led to punishment, but more often it meant a subtle withdrawal of trust, a silence heavier than any reprimand. Clara, in contrast, had become more unpredictable. Her letters, which had once carried soft, persuasive tones, now vibrated with a restless energy that suggested both desire and impatience. Where Eleanor demanded, Clara implored. Where Eleanor strategized, Clara tested boundaries. Samuel quickly realized that her increasing assertiveness was not motivated by cruelty, but by a complex mixture of dependency, fear, and curiosity. She seemed both fearful of losing him entirely to Eleanor's influence and desirous of asserting her own quiet claim. The tension between the sisters, which had always existed in a shadowed corner of the household, now expanded into every interaction, every letter, and every glance. Samuel was no longer merely a servant navigating routine. He had become the axis around which their unspoken struggles revolved, a living intermediary between desire, power, and secrecy. The arrival of autumn brought with it not only the change of season, but also a subtle shift in the household's rhythm. Tasks that had once been predictable became loaded with new meaning. Meals were scrutinized not only for their preparation but for the timing of their delivery. Small mistakes previously overlooked were now interpreted as indicators of intention, understanding, or lack thereof. Samuel became hyper-aware of his movements, calculating the angle, ease of his gaze, the inflections of his voice, and even the timing of his footsteps as he navigated the corridors of the Harrow home. Each letter he delivered or received carried weight, and with the shift in the sisters' interactions, the mental burden of interpretation grew heavier. He began to feel as though the house itself had absorbed their tensions, its walls expanding and contracting with the subtle shifts in control and desire that ebbed and flowed between Eleanor and Clara. Outside, the world seemed indifferent to the intricate psychological dance unfolding within the plantation's walls. The Mississippi sun cast long shadows across the cotton fields, but these shadows brought no relief, only a reminder of the larger social structures that rendered Samuel invisible to everyone outside the house. To the overseers, neighbors, and visitors, he was a figure defined by utility, a worker, a presence, a resource. Yet inside the Harrow household, he was both essential and perilous, a man whose very existence had been woven into the sisters' lives to such a degree that any misstep threatened the delicate balance of authority and secrecy. This awareness did not make him reckless, rather it sharpened his senses, his judgment, and his capacity for patience. Survival, Samuel understood, required the careful calibration of action, silence, and observation, each chosen moment a strategic maneuver in a game whose rules were imposed by the women whose wills had become inseparable from his own daily reality. As the leaves turned from green to shades of amber and gold, Eleanor's letters took on a more deliberate tone, reflecting her heightened concern with appearances and propriety. She was acutely aware of the scrutiny of neighbors, the potential for gossip, and the need to maintain a facade of normalcy that masked the deeper complexities of the household. Instructions were increasingly veiled in metaphor, demanding that Samuel read and act not only upon what was written, but also upon what remained unspoken. He was expected to anticipate not only the desires of the present, but the implications of events that had not yet occurred, predicting moods, mitigating tensions, and ensuring that both sisters remained satisfied and their reputations intact. Samuel's capacity for discretion had become both his survival mechanism and his prison, a constant invisible labor that consumed him from dawn to dusk and lingered in the dark hours when sleep should have brought reprieve. Clara, sensing the increasing control exerted by Eleanor, began to assert herself more overtly, yet always subtly, as though testing the boundaries of what could be claimed without direct confrontation. Her letters contained coded requests, embedded desires, and hints of strategic observation. Samuel's task was to interpret these signals without allowing Eleanor to perceive them as insubordination, maintaining equilibrium in a household where any imbalance could have dramatic consequences. He learned to read the subtext, to notice the nuances in the curl of a word, the placement of a comma, or the spacing between lines. Each letter was a layer of psychological complexity, a puzzle that required not only literacy, but deep insight into human behavior, power dynamics, and survival under the constant scrutiny of two women whose wills were absolute within the microcosm of the plantation house. The interplay of control, dependency, and secrecy intensified as the season deepened. Samuel found that the letters themselves had become a living extension of the sisters' presence, carrying their intentions into spaces he could not occupy physically. Even when absent from a room, the content and tone of their correspondence dictated his movements, his attention, and his choices. Every action he took was a response to a message that had already traveled through ink and paper, a preemptive execution of desires that were partially articulated and partially implied. The psychological labo of this task was immense, leaving Samuel in a state of perpetual vigilance, his mind attuned to subtle shifts in the household's atmosphere, the sisters' moods, and the potential for unspoken tension to erupt into observable conflict. Autumn's encroaching chill brought with it a new awareness of mortality and impermanence, though this awareness did not manifest as relief or escape. Instead, it intensified the sense of urgency and fragility that pervaded the Harrow household. Eleanor, ever mindful of reputation, began to plan for contingencies, encoding instructions that could guide the household in her absence, or in moments when her judgment was compromised. Clara, increasingly impatient with the subtleties of control, continued to push boundaries, inserting herself more forcefully into the rhythms of the household and into the letters that Samuel carried, translating them into actions that were both subtle and irreversible. Samuel, caught between these two currents, understood that the equilibrium he maintained was inherently unstable, subject to disruption not only by misinterpretation, but by the simple force of human desire, fear, and ambition. The psychological weight of these months reached a peak during the harvest, when the demands of the plantation intensified. Samuel's daily routine expanded to encompass not only household management, but the supervision of field labor, coordination with overseers, and the meticulous execution of both sisters' instructions in all spheres of activity. Each day presented a series of decisions, none of which were neutral, all of which carried the potential for misalignment with the sisters' expectations. Samuel's ability to anticipate consequences, interpret unspoken cues, and act decisively became critical to the maintenance of order and the prevention of visible conflict. The letters, increasingly coded and nuanced, served as both instruction and warning, guiding him through an environment in which the cost of error was both immediate and enduring. By late autumn, Samuel had internalized the rhythms and logic of the household to such a degree that he functioned almost as an extension of the sisters' will. His movements, actions, and decisions reflected an intimate understanding of their desires, fears, and strategies. Yet this mastery came with profound isolation. He was surrounded by people but remained fundamentally alone, the weight of responsibility and secrecy pressing down on him in ways that few could comprehend. The letters, now carefully stored and repeatedly consulted, formed a kind of map of influence, a record of both command and expectation, of desire and control, and of the silent, pervasive power that the sisters wielded over him without ever articulating it directly. As autumn waned, the cumulative tension within the household reached a level that was nearly tangible. The interplay of letters, actions, silences, and glances had created a lattice of obligation and influence so intricate that any disruption could have cascading consequences. Samuel navigated this lattice with skill, patience, and endurance, aware that his survival and the continued functioning of the household depended upon his ability to maintain the delicate balance of power that had been imposed upon him. Every step, every glance, every act of interpretation was both a demonstration of competence and a shield against potential censure, punishment, or exposure. Samuel had become the fulcrum upon which the Harrow household turned, the axis of authority and secrecy that sustained the fragile equilibrium between Eleanor, Clara, and the wider social world. By the time the first snows of winter whispered across the distant riverbanks, the dynamics of the Harrow household had transformed into a complex, almost ritualized pattern. Samuel's life was defined by anticipation, interpretation, and action, his every movement guided by letters, silences, and the subtle cues of two women whose control was absolute. Within the microcosm of the plantation house, the balance was delicate, the pressures immense, and the consequences of miscalculation profound. Yet through it all, Samuel endured, navigating the web of power, secrecy, and expectation with a skill honed through months of observation, reflection, and unbroken vigilance. He had become both participant and witness, executor and interpreter, bound to the household not only by circumstance, but by the intricate, unspoken strategies that defined life within the Harrow plantation. As the first snows of winter began to settle over the Mississippi landscape, the Harrow plantation seemed to exhale a slow, frozen breath, as though even the house itself recognized the weight of months spent in silence, tension, and the unrelenting orchestration of power. Samuel, who had once moved through the halls with measured caution, now navigated them with a profound understanding of the invisible threads that connected every action, glance, and word to the sisters' desires and fears. Each letter, previously a guide and a warning, had become a chronicle of the unspoken, a record of control, dependency, and survival that only he could truly interpret. The sisters' influence over him, though unarticulated, had reached its apex, and he understood with a clarity that bordered on dread that the equilibrium they maintained was neither natural nor sustainable. It existed solely because he had assumed responsibility for it, because he had become the vessel through which their intentions, ambitions, and insecurities flowed and were translated into action. Eleanor, ever vigilant and meticulous, had grown more deliberate in her instructions. No longer content with mere suggestion or implication, she began to encode contingencies within contingencies, folding layers of meaning into each sentence she wrote, each command she issued. She anticipated not only the immediate consequences of her directives, but also the potential chain reactions, the unforeseen interpretations that might ripple through the household, and the way in which Samuel would interpret, mediate, and enact these instructions. Her control was no longer passive or reactive. It had become an active, almost surgical manipulation of circumstance, carried out through the medium of letters, silences, and the subtle surveillance of the household's routines. Samuel, aware of this escalating complexity, adapted his strategies accordingly, calibrating his every movement, word, and decision to preserve balance while avoiding exposure. The house had become a theater in which every gesture mattered, every glance was weighed, and every sound could betray the fragile equilibrium. Clara, in contrast, had embraced a more chaotic form of influence. Her letters, once restrained by timidity and caution, now carried a bristling urgency, as if she were attempting to assert authority through the very ambiguity that had long characterized their correspondence. She wove suggestion with command, fear with desire, and dependence with assertion, creating documents that were simultaneously plea and strategy. Samuel found himself reading them with a meticulous attention that bordered on obsession, analyzing the placement of words, the spacing between lines, and the subtleties of punctuation to discern meaning. Every letter was a negotiation, a trial in which his judgment, discretion, and endurance were tested, and the stakes were nothing less than the continued functioning of the household, and, by extension, his own survival. As winter deepened, the psychological strain of this environment intensified. Samuel's movements, once fluid and almost instinctive, became measured to an almost painful degree. He anticipated potential tensions before they materialized, neutralized latent conflicts before they erupted, and mediated subtle competitions between the sisters with an expertise born of necessity. The letters themselves, which had begun as mere instruments of communication, had become maps, guides, and warnings, chronicling the ever-shifting terrain of influence, desire, and secrecy. Samuel had become not only their intermediary but their guardian, the keeper of an equilibrium that existed solely through his vigilance and insight. He understood, in moments of rare clarity, that his own agency had been subsumed within the mechanisms of control that governed the household. Survival was no longer a matter of physical endurance alone. It had become an exercise in psychological and strategic mastery. The social world outside the plantation remained indifferent, even blind, to the subtleties of these internal dynamics. Overseers, neighbors, and visitors saw only a well-run household, a family bound by propriety, and an enslaved man whose duties were performed without apparent complaint or deviation. Yet within the walls of the house, Samuel's existence was a fulcrum upon which the power, desire, and secrecy of two sisters balanced precariously. He moved through the halls like a shadow, present yet unseen, interpreting every nuance, mediating every tension, and absorbing the weight of influence that neither sister could entirely wield alone. The letters, carefully folded and hidden in drawers, under floorboards, and inside the bindings of ledgers, became repositories of memory, proof, and strategy, documents that would one day bear witness to what had transpired behind the facade of domestic normalcy. The weeks stretched on, each one marked by subtle escalation. Eleanor's vigilance became more pronounced, her letters longer and more densely coded. Clara's urgency increased, her suggestions sharper, her emotional fluctuations more evident in the cadence of her writing. Samuel, caught in the continuous interpretation of these messages, developed a mental architecture of the household's power dynamics, a system in which every action, inaction, glance, and gesture was catalogued and weighed for potential consequence. His life had become an intricate choreography of prediction, adaptation, and endurance. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and punctuated by fragments of letters, imagined confrontations, and calculations of risk. Even as the snow thickened outside, the invisible pressures within the house remained unrelenting, each day a replication of the previous, yet subtly altered by shifts in the sisters' moods, intentions, and strategies. As the new year approached, the cumulative weight of months spent in this carefully managed tension began to bear down on all three of them. Eleanor's control, once surgical and precise, now carried the edge of obsession. She scrutinized every corner of the house, every servant, and every interaction, her gaze extending metaphorically to the past, present, and potential future. Clara, sensing the tightening of this control, escalated her own influence in parallel, weaving her own strategies into the fabric of the household, testing boundaries, and challenging the invisible constraints that had been placed upon her. Samuel, standing at the center of this dynamic, recognized that the equilibrium he had maintained for so long was fragile, poised on the edge of collapse. Every decision, every action, and every interpretation now carried the potential to tip the balance irreversibly. It was during these months that the letters themselves took on a historical weight. What had begun as simple instructions, requests, or expressions of emotion had become chronicles of survival, coded maps of influence, and silent testimonies to the realities of power, desire, and control in a household defined by secrecy. Samuel's task was not merely to interpret and act upon these documents, but to ensure that their contents remained hidden, their intentions obscured, and their implications contained. The letters became extensions of the sisters' wills, instruments through which they could project authority, negotiate desire, and manage fear without direct confrontation. Samuel's life, thus in W, enid with the written word, became both a vessel for their intentions and a shield protecting the fragile web of secrecy that sustained the household. By late winter, the psychological tension within the house had become almost palpable. Samuel moved through the rooms with a deliberate quiet, anticipating not only the immediate consequences of his actions, but also the subtle ripple effects that could cascade through the household. The letters, now meticulously organized and cross-referenced in his mind, dictated his schedule, his priorities, and even his emotional presentation. Eleanor and Clara, each aware of the other's increasing assertiveness, relied upon Samuel to mediate potential conflicts, translating unspoken intentions into action, smoothing friction, and maintaining the fragile appearance of harmony. The household had become a complex ecosystem in which every gesture, glance, and word was weighted with meaning, and Samuel was both participant and guardian, observer and executor, bound to the sisters' wills in ways that exceeded mere physical labor. The arrival of spring brought with it the first signs of physical change in the landscape, yet the dynamics within the house remained frozen in tension. Samuel continued to serve as the hinge between the sisters, interpreting letters, anticipating desires, and managing the delicate balance of influence that had become the core of his existence. Each letter, carefully folded and hidden, carried the legacy of months of strategy, manipulation, and endurance. These documents, silent yet potent, contained the accumulated weight of power and secrecy, serving as both instruction and record, proof and warning. Samuel had become the living embodiment of the household's hidden narrative, a witness to and participant in a story that would never be fully acknowledged outside the walls of the Harrow plantation. It was in this context, as the river thawed and the first shoots of green appeared in the fields, that Samuel recognized the ultimate truth of his situation. The equilibrium he had maintained was not sustainable, and the secrecy upon which it depended could never be permanent. Eleanor and Clara, bound by familial loyalty and personal desire, had constructed a world in which power was mediated through him, yet this world could not endure indefinitely. The letters, once instruments of control and communication, now bore the weight of history, their contents a silent testament to the complex interplay of authority, desire, and survival that had defined the past months. Samuel understood that when the arrangement finally dissolved, whether through accident, discovery, or deliberate revelation, the legacy of their interaction would persist in these fragile folded pages, the only enduring record of what had transpired within the Harrow household. In the end, the Harrow plantation endured as a monument to silence and secrecy. Eleanor's name persisted in records of propriety and social standing. Clara's restlessness was noted only in minor family anecdotes. Samuel, who had navigated the psychological labyrinth of power, influence, and secrecy, disappeared from official documentation, his existence acknowledged only in the letters that had passed through his hands. These letters, hidden and forgotten for years, eventually resurfaced, revealing the contours of a story that was otherwise lost to history, a story of survival, coercion, manipulation, and endurance, carried not in ledgers, census records, or legal documents, but in the inked testimony of those who had wielded power and those who had mediated it with every ounce of discretion they could muster. The significance of these letters cannot be overstated. They are not simply evidence of events, they are instruments of memory, guardians of a narrative that would have otherwise been erased. They reveal the invisible labor of survival, the weight of unacknowledged authority, and the complex interplay of human desire and constraint. Within a society structured by oppression. Samuel's life, mediated through these documents, demonstrates that history is not recorded solely through those who hold power, but also through those who endure it, interpret it, and ensure its continuity, even when recognition is denied. As we close this chapter, it is important to reflect on the lessons embedded in the story of Samuel and the Harrow sisters. History, particularly the hidden histories of those subjected to systemic oppression, is rarely neat or complete. It is constructed, maintained, and sometimes revealed through fragments, silences, and documents that survive by accident or design. The letters that survived the Harrow household offer a rare glimpse into the interior life of a domestic arrangement defined by secrecy, coercion, and subtle forms of control. They remind us that the past is always layered, that survival often requires skill and patience beyond the obvious, and that the stories of those like Samuel are preserved not by grand narratives, but by the delicate traces they leave behind. If this story unsettled you, made you reflect, or drew you into a world you never imagined existed, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon to never miss a story that history tried to erase, and leave a comment telling us how much the story moved you. These letters, this life, and this story endure only because they are remembered and shared, and by engaging with them, you continue the work of ensuring that the voices history attempted to silence are finally heard.